Hey folks, today we've got a complete in-depth review of the new Garmin HRM-PRO Plus. This is Garmin's top-end heart rate strap designed really for Garmin consumers more so than anyone else. Meaning if you've got a Garmin device, in particular a Garmin watch, this is probably the strap that you want. Versus if you have some other watch from another company like Polar, Suunto, or Apple, this is a nice strap, but really probably a bit overkill. Now, the Garmin HRM-PRO Plus has a couple of notable upgrades on the hardware side as well as the software side. The good news, though, is the software side updates are coming to the HRM-PRO, which is the yellow one right there, versus the HRM-PRO Plus being the white one, will have them baked in. Those updates are actually dropping today, the same moment this video releases. So you can go ahead and get all the things I talked about in this video if you already have the existing, almost 2-year-old HRM-PRO. Now, the main purpose of a heart rate strap tends to be more accurate data, primarily in edge cases. So things where you may be flexing your wrist quite a bit, which can impact optical heart rate accuracy of a wrist-based watch or something like that. The same goes as well if you're in cold weather and want to put the watch on the outside of your jacket. Obviously, the optical heart rate sensor can't not go through that clothing. So those are all examples of that. And some people just simply prefer heart rate straps over wrist-based optical heart rate, depending on the particular sport that they do. Now, in the case of all these straps, they do go ahead and transmit out on ANT Plus as well as Bluetooth Smart and a ton of other data metrics in that. And that's why I mentioned earlier on that these are really designed for Garmin users more so than anyone else. So starting off with what's in the box, you've got the strap itself, you've got some paper stuff, and that's pretty much it. But the big notable change here is the new battery compartment. So one of the complaints with the existing HRM Pro strap, as well as the HRM Run, HRM Tri, and most of other Garmin's higher-end straps over the years, is that when you went to go ahead and remove the battery compartment using the tools, so these little 4 screws right there, after you did that, the waterproofing wasn't always super awesome. And the reasons for that probably varied as to why straps were often killed after the fact, but nonetheless, that happened. And so people obviously, rightly so, became upset. So this new strap, you still remove the little rubber piece just like before, like that, but now it's got toolless entry, which means you rotate it as simple as that, pop it open, and there is the battery compartment, and also this nifty little tab that makes it easy to get the battery out. You can see that it's pretty handy. Like usually you have to drop the battery a couple times when you have these sort of compartments, but it's got that right there, and it pops back in place. You just simply lock it, and you can see it locks right in. Super easy versus the 4 screws there and trying to get it all reset and whatnot. Now these coin cell batteries will last up to about a year or so, depending on how often you use it, even 2 years if you don't use it that often, and then for some people, it'll only be 6 or so months. Now Garmin says the only difference between the HRM-PRO and the HRM-PRO Plus is the battery compartment and the components around it. So everything else remains the same from a software standpoint, as I mentioned earlier on with that firmware update, but that's the only difference there. One caveat though is that some countries, notably Australia, does not allow Garmin to sell this particular device in there because it's considered toolless entry to a coin cell battery. And for child safety reasons, they don't allow this anymore. It's a relatively new restriction, relatively new regulation, so it's going to start impacting more and more devices as things go forward. Nonetheless, for the rest of the world, you can buy it. It's the exact same price as before at $129 US. I would expect you'll see basically the HRM-PRO just simply get phased out in most countries, with the HRM-PRO Plus being kind of put in place of that. Now is a good time to mention, if you're finding this video interesting and useful, go ahead and give it a whack or a like, or go whack the like button. You get the point down the bottom there. It really helps with the video and the channel quite a bit. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, there are a lot of advanced metrics that the HRM-PRO kind of contributes to your Garmin account. So the first thing you want to do is pair it up to your Garmin Connect mobile app, either on Android or iOS. And the reason for that is that if you wear just a strap by itself without any Garmin watch, though again, you really do want a Garmin watch here, it'll go ahead and transmit certain data types behind the scenes. This is useful if you have some sports like soccer or football or some martial arts where you're not allowed to wear a watch on you. It'll go ahead and transmit intensity minutes, steps, heart rate, and calories without you wearing a watch at all. Now, that's notably different than something like the Polar H10 or the Wahoo Ticker series, where you can go out, do an activity, come back, and it'll automatically pick that activity out. With the Garmin straps, you have to have something controlling the activity. So in the case of swimming, for example, you can wear this strap while swimming, and it'll go ahead and record your data from the chest strap while you're swimming, because optical heart rate doesn't tend to work super well on swimming. But in order to start that activity, you do need a Garmin watch to start that particular swim. The same is true of soccer or anything like that. versus the 4 metrics I just mentioned a second ago, intensity minutes, heart rate, steps, and calories. That'll happen even if you don't have a watch. But just to understand, there is that difference between those 24/7 metrics and doing a one-off workout and creating that workout file from just the strap without any sort of app or watch controlling it. Now, of course, you can still use an app like Strava or others to connect to this strap, as you can see right here, and go ahead and record the activity that way. But again, by itself, this strap will not record an activity unless something else is controlling it or triggering it. Now, speaking of pairing, this supports 3 concurrent Bluetooth smart connections, as well as unlimited AMP Plus connections. So this means I can pair it to apps again like Zwift or Strava or Map My Ride, or there's literally thousands of apps out there that support these Bluetooth and AMP Plus standards, and virtually every device out there supports this. It's pretty much impossible to find a device or an app that will not support this strap. Now, when it comes to sports and pairing with the Garmin watch, you're going to want to pair it over AMP Plus. Unless there's some issue that you have connectivity-wise with interference in your house, you're going to want to pair that over AMP Plus. And the reason for that is that Garmin transmits additional data over AMP Plus that they do not transmit over Bluetooth Smart, in particular on the running side. So starting off with that running bit there, they transmit run dynamics data. So that is things like vertical oscillation and ground contact time. And you can see those all on the screen right now. That's displayed both on the watch itself while you're running, but also afterwards in Garmin Connect. Now, as to whether or not people actually use that data long term, it's probably pretty questionable. But the piece that people are starting to use is running power, and that is also transmitted from these devices as well. If you've got an older Garmin watch, you can use Garmin's Connect IQ app for running power to go and connect it to the HRM-PRO or HRM-PRO Plus. And if you've got a newer watch, one of the 2022 models like a Fenix 7 or a Forerunner 955 or 255 or Instinct 2, they can actually use this sensor directly without having to have the Connect IQ app downloaded. And you'll still get that running power displayed natively on the watch, as well as things like the structured workouts supporting native running power too. The other area where the AMP Plus connection is important is for cross-country skiing as well as swimming. So on the cross-country skiing side, there's actually cross-country skiing power, and on the swimming side, it'll do the offloading of your workouts after the fact. So basically, it'll offload that swimming heart rate data, it'll sync it together from the strap, and then the watch data once you finish your swim. Now that we get to one of the new features on the HRM-PRO Plus, that again is also coming to the HRM-PRO, which is the indoor running pace and distance. In fact, actually just running pace and distance in total. You can use this both outdoors and indoors. The way it works is that the HRM-PRO Plus will be automatically calibrated when you're running outside with GPS with the Garmin watch. And Garmin says about 2 hours worth of running time, not necessarily all at once, but over the course of potentially many different days, is sort of that starting point for having that calibration data. Ideally, you'll be doing that on flatter ground, flatter terrain, or terrain that doesn't have bad GPS signal, because you want to have kind of clean data being fed into that. In fact, while you're doing that automatic calibration, which just happens automatically, as its name implies, behind the scenes, if Garmin detects too much hills or bad GPS data, they'll discard that calibration data from that portion of the run. So you don't have to worry too much about it. In my case, I went out and ran for a whole bunch of hours, more than 2 hours, to get that automatic calibration data in there. Also, it's worthwhile noting when you're outside, ideally you'll be doing different paces on this to get calibration data across different pace groups. That's something that Garmin basically bucketizes their calibration data based on those pace groups. So you have a different calibration factor when you're running faster and sprinting, for example, than you would at steady state or at walking. So they do actually bucketize that across all different pace groups. The other option for calibration of this is to do it on a treadmill, where you do basically the exact same thing, go inside in a treadmill, run a set distance of at least 1.5 kilometers, ideally at different pace groups, or pace groups that are representative of the workouts that you'll be doing anyways. And at the end, it'll ask you for the treadmill display distance. You put that in and it calibrates the strap. So in my case, I did both of those. As I said earlier, I went out and ran for a number of weeks, first off to calibrate this with outdoor GPS data, and then I jumped on the treadmill. And I basically did a workout where I was going to repeat it twice. The workout once with the outdoor data, and I would accept the changes at the end of it, and I would do it again with the indoor data. Now for my test here, I got 4 different data sets. I've got the HRM-PRO Plus on my chest. I've got a Forerunner 255 on my right wrist, the same one right there. That's just using the wrist-based pace and distance, which is super interesting in just a second. I've got the Stride V2, or the most recent foot pod, so that's down the bottom of my running shoe. And then I have a Technogym My Run treadmill, which is one of the higher end running treadmills a lot of people use for indoor running, especially with Zwift and things like that. So for this first test, I did a warm up and then followed up by a bunch of 60 to 90 second intervals at relatively high paces. And as you can see, the Stride and HRM-PRO Pro Plus were virtually identical across the board, like super impressive actually based on that. And the Technogym was relatively close, a little bit higher. there. Keep in mind though, the way the treadmill reports, it reports its set pace as opposed to the actual pace you're doing. So you can see like those lines shoot up right away, but you'll notice it takes longer for the treadmill to get up, which is why you see the pace lag a little bit on the strap and the stride, because the strap and the stride are correct. Meanwhile, the wrist-based 455 is kind of all over the place. Nonetheless, at the end of this, the total distances were very, very close, but I chose to go and accept what the treadmill distance was, so I adjusted that to treadmill distance, which is about 1/10 of a kilometer off, so about 100 meters off, and I did the exact same test again, like literally back to back. And you can see here, now the HRM-PRO Plus is relatively closely matching the Technogym unit because it's got that adjustment factor to it. Again, still that same slight delay there when you see each one of those intervals start, because again, both the stride and the HRM-PRO Plus are correct in that delay because it takes time for the treadmill to ramp up speeds, going from what was basically 10 kilometers an hour up to 16 kilometers an hour. But once it stabilized there, the HRM-PRO Plus was close to the treadmill and the stride was a bit lower. Now, of course, those of you that run on treadmills know that treadmill accuracy is like a hot potato at best. And I don't really know in this case whether or not that treadmill is exactly correct. It is basically brand new though, so hopefully it's relatively correct. But I would be betting my money more on the stride and HRM-PRO Plus agreement than I would on the treadmill, just if I had to guess which one's probably right. Nonetheless, you can see the strap did exactly what it was supposed to do. It adjusted its paces and calibration factor to match the treadmill. If it was me, I'd probably go back and reset that. And the cool thing is you could remove that calibration factor if you want to and go back to what you had before. However, perhaps the most interesting takeaway from this test was actually the wrist-based pace on the 455 on my right wrist. This is a perfect example of having the correct distance at the end, the correct average, pace and distance, but being 100% wrong the rest of the time. As you can see during the warm-up of both sets, it was way too fast, way too high. And then you can see during the sprint portions, it was way too low. So it was wrong the entire time, but still ended up being right at the end for the distance. But of course, from a running standpoint, having the correct pace is far more important than just simply getting the right distance. If I was following the pace on the watch, I'd be way under on the warm-ups and way over pace on the sprint portions. So this is a perfect example where the strap or stride or some other factor is better to use than the wrist-based. But what's notable here is that I've run with the 255 and the 955 on my wrist, on these wrists, for over 2 months now. So there's tons of calibration data there. And then even further into that is that I found my left wrist is very accurate when it comes to the wrist-based pace on a treadmill, but my right wrist, not so much. So whatever I do running style-wise is quite visibly, as you can see here in the shot, quite different on the left side versus the right side, and they just don't seem to match outdoors versus indoors. Anyways, as for the strap itself, the point here being that this seems like a pretty good alternative to stride at roughly half the price if you want accurate pacing and distance, either indoors or outdoors. And the cool part is there's an option to choose on the watch whether or not you want to use the pace and thus the distance from the strap. By default on the Garmin watches, it'll go ahead and use the GPS for outdoor runs, and for indoor runs, it'll use the chest strap if it's connected. But you can change that if you want to and use the chest strap outdoors as well for pacing distance, which a number of people do use with their stride sensor today. And then you can also turn it off entirely where your chest strap is only used for heart rate, whether you're indoors or outdoors. Nonetheless, if I compare the stride distance to the Garmin HRM-PRO Plus or the HRM-PRO with the firmware update, they were virtually identical across walking, kind of easy state running, as well as full-out sprints, and they responded virtually the same as well. Now, before we wrap things up, let's talk about heart rate accuracy. For that, we'll jump over the computer. Now, I recognize these charts can be hard to see, but don't worry, I've linked to the charts down below in the description. So for this first one here, this intervals on the treadmill, you can see it's virtually identical, not virtually, it is absolutely identical to the Polar H10. Then if we look at this trail run here, it's again identical to the Garmin HRM-PRO, the original one. That's going to be the trend, by the way, which is why this section is going to be so darn short. And then here we are on a city run. You can see compared to Garmin's 255 on the optical heart rate sensor, it's actually identical to that too as well. Pretty solid there. The Whoop strap struggled a little bit at the very beginning, the Whoop 0.40 strap. And then here on this hour-and-a-half outdoor ride, if I compare it again to the Polar H10, as well as the Polar Verity Sense optical heart rate sensor, it is once again identical. And then finally finishing up the treadmill one last time for this one more interval workout. Again, it's identical. Look, it's perfectly accurate, just like it was accurate before. Everything is absolutely spot on. Okay, there you go, a complete look at the new Garmin HRM-PRO Plus. I think this will solve a lot of the concerns people had around the battery compartment of their HRM-PRO. Hopefully it works out long-term as well, of course. That's something we don't really know today, but will take realistically, 8 months or a year or so until we get lots of reports from people to see how this works long-term. But in terms of whether or not you would want to splurge on these Garmin straps versus something like the Polar H10, which is, $80 or so, or a Wahoo Ticker, which is $60, it really depends on what you're doing. I would say if you're in that Garmin ecosystem of Garmin watches, then the HRM Pro makes sense if you want some of those extra data points. If you don't care about the extra data, if you don't care about syncing in like intensity minutes without a watch, then something like the Polar H10 is just as good, just as accurate, and like 2/3 the price. So something to consider. Anyways, hopefully you found this video interesting and useful. If so, go ahead and whack that like button at the bottom there, or subscribe for plenty more sports technology goodness. We've got Eurobike this week. We've got lots of other goodness going on. You don't want to miss any of it. With that, have a good one.